The first time I saw Karen Bell striding across my freshly mowed lawn, clipboard in hand, I thought it was a casual mistake. A misstep by a nosy neighbor, maybe. But as the sun dipped behind the horizon that Thursday evening, painting my suburban street in streaks of crimson and gold, I realized Karen wasn't just wandering, she was staking claim. I had lived on Maplewood Drive for nearly a decade. My home, a modest but carefully maintained two-story with white siding and a navy blue door, had always been my sanctuary. I liked the quiet mornings, the hum of cicadas in summer, and the occasional waves to passing neighbors. But Karen Bell didn't care about sanctuaries. She was a storm in human form, a one-woman HOA enforcer with a voice that could cut glass and a temperament as sharp as the stilettos she wore even on damp grass. The first intrusion was subtle, a complaint slipped under my door about my garden gnome's unauthorized positioning. I laughed it off. The second was a verbal assault across the fence, her tone accusing me of violating aesthetic codes because my hydrangeas weren't perfectly aligned. By the third incident, I had grown wary. She didn't knock. She didn't ask. She just entered, as if my yard were public property and her authority absolute. That night, I sat on my back porch, nursing a glass of bourbon, staring at the neat rows of petunias I had planted that spring. The faint scent of lavender mingled with the smoke of my neighbor's barbecue. And then, I saw her. Karen, high heels sinking slightly into my lawn, clipboard tucked under her arm, glaring at the edge of my flower bed like a general inspecting territory. "Mr. Foster," she called, her voice carrying across the yard. "Your grass is uneven. I'm going to have to report this." I stood, gripping my glass tighter than necessary, my patience snapping. "Karen, this is my property. Please stay off it." But Karen just tilted her head, eyes narrowing with the smug satisfaction of someone who believes rules exist only to be enforced by themselves. "Oh, I don't think you understand the rules of the HOA, John. I have every right to check." That's when it hit me. The weeks of passive-aggressive notes, the threats to call the city, the constant hovering. It wasn't just about aesthetics. Karen Bell thrived on control. She fed off the fear she instilled. And tonight, she had chosen me as her latest victim. I spent the next several days brainstorming ways to reclaim my sanity without inviting legal trouble or worse, retaliation. Traditional methods, signs, polite warnings, calls to the HOA board had failed. Karen didn't respond to reason. She didn't respect boundaries. So I started thinking creatively. Dangerous, maybe. But creative. It was in the cluttered garage, beneath the hum of the old fluorescent lights, that I stumbled upon an idea. Color powder, vibrant, explosive, and utterly messy. Not harmful, just chaotic, the kind of theatrical retaliation that would send a clear message. I envisioned it like a scene from an old spy movie, Karen stepping onto my lawn, clipboard in hand, only to be engulfed in a cloud of bright magenta, neon green, and electric blue. The thrill of it pulsed through me. I began experimenting quietly, mixing powders, testing small bursts behind the garage where no one could see. Each pop of color filled the space with a startling brilliance, a harmless explosion that left a lingering mist of pigment. The smell was faintly sweet, like candy. The more I worked, the more I could see the scene playing out in my mind, the moment of surprise, the gasp, the retreat. But it wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming my home, restoring control over my own space. Karen Bell had terrorized me for too long, and I was ready to turn the tables in a way that was undeniably memorable. As dusk fell again, the orange sky mirrored my determination. I set up the first of the powder canisters along the edge of the lawn, hidden beneath low bushes. Each was rigged to a simple pressure trigger, perfectly calibrated to explode under the weight of a footstep. I paced the yard like a general preparing for battle, the anticipation twisting in my chest. Then I waited. Hours passed. I barely slept, peering through the blinds as the world outside quieted. And then, finally, the sound I had been both dreading and craving, the soft crunch of heels against grass. My heart hammered as I saw her silhouette emerge from the streetlight glow. Karen Bell, armed with clipboard and indignation, was advancing as though she had never been warned. I crouched behind the hydrangeas, breath shallow, finger hovering over the remote detonator. Time seemed to stretch, every second amplifying the tension. This was the moment. The first canister went off with a puff of magenta powder, the blast startling enough to make Karen freeze mid-step. Her face, once stern and calculating, transformed into a portrait of shock. The second triggered automatically as she backed up, the neon green enveloping her in a cloud that shimmered under the streetlights. She tried to wave her hands, to scream, to maintain dignity, but dignity was useless against this kind of chaos. I held my breath, watching from the shadows as the final canister burst, electric blue swirling like smoke around her. Karen staggered, blinking, coughing lightly, her pristine white blouse now a canvas of wild, psychedelic colors. She looked at me, eyes wide with disbelief, and for a moment, I felt a surge of satisfaction so intense it made my chest ache. But then, the story wasn't over. I realized, as Karen disappeared down the street, muttering threats and wiping at the powder with trembling hands, that my actions had consequences. Neighbors would talk. The HOA might intervene. And Karen Bell? She would return. She always returned. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I knew that Chapter 2 of this suburban war was inevitable. Karen Bell had been temporarily defeated, yes, but she was far from beaten. And I, John Foster, had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of bright powder, a reminder that sometimes, even in the quietest neighborhoods, chaos could bloom like wildfire. The next morning, the aftermath of my colorful ambush was both exhilarating and nerve-wracking. My lawn, which had once been pristine, bore subtle traces of powder in hidden corners, remnants of the small explosions that had transformed a quiet suburban evening into a spectacle of chaos. But it wasn't the powder I worried about, it was Karen Bell. The woman had survived the spectacle, humiliated but unbroken, and in my experience, unbroken Karen Bell was far more dangerous than any cloud of color. I sipped my coffee on the porch, eyes scanning the street. The neighbors' mailboxes glinted in the early sunlight, cars parked in neat lines like soldiers awaiting inspection. Everyone seemed oblivious to the war that had just unfolded in my yard. But I knew better. I could feel it, the tension of a simmering storm. Karen wouldn't let this slide. She was already plotting, scheming, planning her counterattack with that precision only she could muster. And sure enough, the first message came by email, a digital scream from the HOA office, punctuated by photographs of her powder-stained blouse. John Foster, it began, the words dripping with fury, your actions yesterday were completely unacceptable. You will remove any and all contraptions from your property immediately, or we will take legal action. I leaned back, smirking despite the knot forming in my stomach. Legal threats were predictable. Karen was a master of rules and regulations, but rules had never frightened me. Still, the email had a curious effect, it forced me to strategize more carefully. I had won a battle, yes, but not the war. The following days were a blur of preparation. I scoured hardware stores, studying timers, triggers, and harmless pyrotechnics. I wanted something dramatic, a true spectacle that would finally cement my lawn as untouchable territory. My mind replayed every step Karen had taken, her precise footfalls, the deliberate pacing of her inspections. I began to understand her methodical approach and, in turn, crafted a plan that would anticipate her every move. Karen didn't take long to respond in person. She appeared one Wednesday afternoon, her high heels clicking sharply against the sidewalk, clipboard in hand. But this time, she wasn't alone. 2 other HOA members trailed behind her, curious onlookers she had summoned as backup. Their expressions were polite yet wary, as if they sensed the hostility brewing like a storm cloud. I watched from behind the kitchen curtain as she approached. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a fleeting second, I could see a flicker of apprehension. Not fear, Karen never feared, but calculation. She was thinking 3 steps ahead, evaluating how to regain her dominance. Mr. Foster, she said, voice clipped and professional. We've come to ensure your property complies with HOA regulations. This is your final warning. I stepped outside, hands visible, feigning calm. Karen, I assure you, everything is perfectly in order. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she tilted her head, inspecting the lawn like a general surveying terrain. Her gaze lingered on the flower beds, the edges of the grass, the subtle dips and rises that had once earned her wrath. Then, her eyes fell to a bush near the sidewalk, the perfect spot for my next surprise. The tension was electric. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I had one chance to make this decisive. One chance to ensure that Karen and anyone who would follow her understood that my property was mine alone. I retreated to the garage, where I had laid out a new arrangement of color powder canisters. This time, they were larger, more intricate, and synchronized with a small remote that allowed me to trigger multiple explosions in sequence. I named them theatrically in my head: Magenta Menace, Emerald Frenzy, and Blue Blitz. The scene unfolded like a carefully choreographed ballet. Karen stepped onto the first patch of lawn, clipboard raised, her focus absolute. I held my breath, finger hovering over the detonator. At the precise moment, the first canister erupted in a vibrant cloud of magenta. She froze mid-step, instinctively flailing her arms to shield her face. The second triggered almost instantly, enveloping her in a surge of green powder that shimmered like liquid emeralds under the sun. The third exploded with a brilliant blue cascade, covering the remaining area. Karen's companions gasped, stepping back in shock, while Karen herself stumbled, disoriented but trying desperately to maintain dignity. She coughed, blinked, and glared, her fury palpable enough to make the air shimmer around her. I stepped forward slowly, letting the spectacle sink in. "Karen, this is my property. You are not welcome here," I said calmly, almost theatrically. Her voice was a hiss, controlled and terrifying. "John, you don't understand the consequences of what you've done. This isn't over. Not even close." And she was right. Karen Bell never backed down. I had struck hard, yes, but in doing so, I had provoked a force more relentless than I had anticipated. Over the next few days, she escalated her efforts: letters from attorneys, neighbors whispering about disturbances, complaints filed with the city about noise and potential hazards. Each attempt was a calculated move to make me question my actions, to undermine my sense of control. Yet, even amidst the tension, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't known before. Karen's obsession had drawn out a part of me that had always been quiet and compliant, a part that now demanded recognition. I wasn't just defending my lawn, I was defending my autonomy, my right to decide who entered my life and on what terms. One evening, as I walked the yard, inspecting the placement of the next set of canisters, I realized something crucial: this was no longer about Karen Bell. This was about boundaries, respect, and the courage to stand firm even when faced with relentless opposition. The powder, the explosions, the spectacle, they were symbols of a simple truth: some battles are worth fighting, no matter how unconventional the methods may be. As dusk fell, the streetlights flickered on, illuminating the carefully arranged devices hidden among the shrubs. The stage was set, not just for another confrontation, but for the final chapter in this suburban saga. Karen Bell would come again, driven by pride and obsession. And I would be ready. The air was thick with anticipation, charged with a tension that made my skin tingle. The neighborhood slept, oblivious to the war quietly brewing in the shadow of picket fences and manicured lawns. But I knew the truth: the next encounter would be decisive, a moment that would finally settle the score. As I stood there, hands on hips, watching the sun bleed into the horizon, I couldn't help but grin. Karen Bell had forced my hand, pushed me into a corner, and for the first time, I realized I wasn't cornered, I was prepared. The final act was coming, and when it arrived, Maplewood Drive would never be the same. The night was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears and made every creak of a branch or rustle of a leaf feel amplified. I crouched behind my favorite hydrangea bush, heart hammering against my ribs, eyes fixed on the street. Tonight, it was not just about color powder or petty revenge. Tonight, it was about finality. The saga with Karen Bell had stretched too long, and I knew, with unshakable certainty, that she would come one last time. I checked the setup once more. Dozens of canisters, each loaded with vibrant powders: magenta, neon green, electric blue, even a few bursts of shocking orange, were strategically placed along the path I anticipated she would take. Each was rigged to explode at precise moments, creating a wave of chaos that would leave her stunned, disoriented, and finally deterred. I felt a mix of exhilaration and apprehension, a tension that made my fingers twitch. Then I heard it, the distinct click of high heels against the sidewalk. My pulse quickened. Karen appeared, clipboard in hand, flanked again by two of her HOA minions, faces grim but curious. The dim streetlights cast long shadows, exaggerating her figure into something almost mythic, like an avenging force determined to conquer. "John Foster," she began, her voice low but carrying the weight of authority, "this ends tonight. You've ignored warnings, violated codes, and..." Her words were cut short as I pressed the remote. The first canister detonated in a dazzling explosion of magenta, erupting into the air like a colorful thundercloud. Karen's expression shifted from indignation to surprise, hands flying instinctively to shield her face. The second triggered almost immediately, a surge of neon green rolling over the lawn in a wave. She stumbled back, muttering curses under her breath, while her companions scrambled, trying to escape the storm of color. I watched, hidden behind the hydrangeas, as the final cascade electric blue and bursts of orange erupted in a synchronized symphony. The cloud enveloped her entirely, swirling like a living thing under the streetlights. Karen's scream, half outrage and half disbelief, echoed down the street. The HOA members flinched, retreating to the sidewalk's edge, witnessing the chaos unfold in stunned silence. When the cloud finally settled, Karen stood there, drenched in every conceivable color, her hair matted, her blouse a kaleidoscope of powder. She glared at me, eyes burning, yet for the first time, I saw hesitation flicker there, just a fraction, but enough. "Do you understand, Karen?" I called, stepping onto the lawn. My voice was calm, deliberate, filled with the authority I had long denied myself. "This is my property. Your inspections, your threats, they end here. You are not welcome." She took a step forward, a flash of fury still alive, but then paused, blinking through the magenta streaks in her hair. The aura of control that had defined her for years seemed to falter. Something in her shifted, the realization that this particular opponent, me, John Foster, was not intimidated. That control had limits, and here, on this lawn, it had met its match. "John," she began, but the words faltered, lost beneath a soft whistle from one of the neighbors watching from across the street. Word of the spectacle had already spread like wildfire. Phones clicked, cameras recorded, and the story of Karen Bell's colorful humiliation began to circulate. I could see the tide turning. Her authority, once absolute in the microcosm of Maplewood Drive, had fractured in a single, brilliant moment. Karen finally turned, muttering threats that were hollow and fading. Her minions followed, glancing back occasionally, as though expecting another explosion to leap from the bushes. But the devices had done their job. The lawn had been defended. The message had been delivered. I exhaled slowly, feeling an almost indescribable relief. The tension that had gripped me for weeks, the anxiety that had made every shadow seem threatening, began to dissipate. I walked through the lawn, hands brushing against the powder that still clung to the grass. It was chaotic, yes, messy, but also symbolic. Every vibrant streak was a marker of boundaries, of autonomy, of the right to control one's own space without interference. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. Word of Karen Bell's powder-strewn defeat spread quickly, whispered at mailboxes and over fences. Some neighbors were amused, others horrified, but all were aware that the tides had shifted. Karen Bell, once untouchable, was now a cautionary tale of obsession and overreach. The HOA sent a formal letter, reluctantly acknowledging that my yard was, indeed, within compliance. They hinted at mediation, perhaps even community service for Karen herself, but the document felt almost trivial compared to the satisfaction of seeing her defeated on her own terms. As I stood on my porch that evening, sipping coffee and watching the sun sink behind the familiar rooftops, a strange sense of calm settled over me. The chaos of color powder, the fear of confrontation, the thrill of standing up, it had all coalesced into a lesson I wouldn't soon forget. Boundaries mattered. Courage mattered. And sometimes, a little creativity could change the course of a conflict entirely. I glanced down at the lawn, still dusted in faint streaks of magenta, green, and blue, and smiled. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't supposed to be, but it was mine. For the first time in weeks, I felt completely at peace in my own home. And somewhere, down the street, I knew Karen Bell would eventually recover, dust herself off, and return to her relentless crusades. But she would think twice before stepping onto my lawn again. The memory of the explosion, the spectacle, and the unmistakable declaration of ownership would remain vivid and unforgettable. Maplewood Drive had returned to normal, or as normal as a street could be after a battle of wills that involved high heels, clipboards, and clouds of color powder. And I, John Foster, had emerged victorious not through aggression, not through fear, but through ingenuity, patience, and a refusal to surrender my space to a tyranny masquerading as authority. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a quiet triumph that was deeper than mere satisfaction. It was a reclaiming of my life, my property, and my peace of mind. And as the final streaks of powder faded into the grass, I knew one thing with perfect clarity: some battles were worth every messy, colorful moment.